I had the experience driving up the hillside with the fellow running the consortia of Soave Classico, and he stops the car and he said, "Okay, John, get out." And he points, he said, "Look at the beautiful lavas, look at the beautiful basalt."
You're listening to the Vint Podcast, bringing you expert interviews, alternative market insights, and exclusive access to the world of wine and spirits investing. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady, joined by Billy Galanko, and today we're talking volcanic wines. How you doing, Billy?
Yeah, really well, especially when we're talking about volcanic wines. Some of my favorites, but otherwise, life is all good on this side. Getting ready for what we'll talk about. Future episodes on Primeur season is just starting to kick off in Bordeaux this time last year. We were tasting there. That stuff.
Are you going to be down there this year?
Nope, we are not going this year. We have our typical network of negociants and everybody on the ground there, as well as the critic reviews. So we feel like we're getting a pretty good sense of the vintage, and we've gotten a lot of notes already, but I definitely want to go back for another year, but this year it's more effective and efficient for us to be here.
And the vintage this year is, or in this 2022 vintage, is a little bit more consensus quality than, there's more consensus around the quality, than there was last time. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, at first blush, we're not going to, everybody's tasting right now, but the year overall was a warmer year, and there's less variability pocket to pocket. Like last year, there was like different areas of weather in terms of coldness, rain, pockets of like mildew and stuff that really randomly affected different areas, as well as some hail. This year, there are a little bit of stuff, and certain pockets are hotter than others. Certain soils handle the heat better, but otherwise it's a little bit more consistent. I would say if I had to pick a year not to taste hundreds of wines, it would be more this year than last year, because last year with the cooler temperatures, there was better acid. This year, these are going to be like tannic beasts because it was so hot, which bodes well for aging, but not for tasting a ton at a time.
That's right. And on the front of volcanic wines in our conversation today, we don't mean wines, I guess, that are bubbling out of the bottle or anything like that. Like, we're talking about volcanic soils, as we'll see in our conversation. Do you want to give listeners just a brief rundown on the impact of volcanic soils on wine and a couple of the regions that we might see them in?
Yeah. So first, I guess I'll take a little step sideways and say our guest today is John Szabo. He is the kind of world's foremost expert on volcanic wines. I'm a big volcanic wine kind of fan or nerd, so I've been trying to, number one, get his book for a while. Turns out it's out of print. We'll talk about that on the podcast, and that's why it's $500 on Amazon. And so basically the next thing I could do instead of reading the book was talking to him. So here we are. But yeah, so volcanic wines as a whole, and I'll just say one reason I tend to like them is they tend to be more minerally driven, less fruit forward. They tend to have more secondary and tertiary notes that aren't necessarily fruit. Certain regions, they also tend to be, from my experience, higher acid as well, and really interestingly structured wines. They have a little bit more depth and nuance to them than I think wines from different other soils. And that's a big blanket statement. Obviously, there's different types of volcanic soils. We'll talk with John about how climate impacts things and really what really goes into making the wine taste a certain way, the variety, all that jazz. But for me, what I've found is minerality tend to be higher acid, well-balanced wines with complexity that you don't, that builds on top of the fruit.
Yeah, and it's also not as binary as the soil where these grapes were grown is volcanic, or it's loamy, or it's chalky. It's not always just one of those things. So when we're saying volcanic wines, I think it's probably an umbrella term for wines produced in regions where some relevant minority, at least, of the percentage makeup of the soil or the earth underneath those vines is volcanic. And in some of these regions, it's almost completely volcanic. Like in one of the regions that I got to explore extensively, the volcanic wines there, Santorini, it's basically entirely built on material there. But there's certainly plenty of others, and I think maybe you're familiar with more of them in Europe. And then, of course, we've both been to Oregon together and actually got to visit believe it was Christum in the valley, Willamette Valley, where we went up to the top of the hill and we got to actually see the layers, some of the volcanic layers that were up there.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say from the top of that hill we could see 3 volcanoes that are actually
we could see volcanoes from the top.
But yeah, so something that's really interesting before we dive into the specific places are also thinking about what volcanic soils actually can do for different regions. So first off, they spew out a lot of minerals and things that the vines and anything really actually can use well to grow fertily. So it's interesting. There's one aspect is nutrients. One aspect in a lot of senses, or a lot of occasions, is drainage. A lot of these soils allow water to just run through and which drainage is really important with wine. You don't ever want the water really sitting there. But interestingly, also at the same time, in addition to drainage, certain volcanic soils, and you can talk about this in Santorini or the Canary Islands, even in Mount Etna in some cases, actually hold soil. Like the pumice, those stones that you see spit out that look like sea sponges, they absorb water over time. Then once they're like full to the brim, they just let the rest of the water run through. So during a hot growing season, the vines have that water accessible to them, even though the climate's really arid. Those are a few of the aspects that also lead to the wines tasting a certain way, or the vines being able to grow, number one. And then being very poor in kind of other organic matter in some cases can also lead those vines to struggle. That they'll get certain nutrients, but they won't get others, and then that produces the flavor of the wine. I would say like one example of really fertile soils that has, to your point earlier, some volcanic mixed in as well as other layers on top would be like, think of, oh my God, we were just talking about Campania in central Italy. So think of one of the reasons the Romans loved the area around like Pompeii, for example, before it exploded, was like everything grew really well there. Like it was growing the best wine around, it was growing the best everything. And part of that is just from millennia of explosions and then going down, and it was really green and nice and people go live there, and then it exploded again and killed a bunch of people. But to this day, it's still one of the most fertile areas in Italy, and it's also producing great wines that are really affordable.
Which can make sense in some of those regions, because especially if people were settling at the base of mountains or like at the base of volcanoes, like you would think that some of those geological structures would actually trap things like storms as they came across and actually make oases at the base of those mountain ranges. And when you have the combination of some of those geographical effects mixed with the climate that kind of naturally comes to that place, and then as you have like eruptions of volcanic material building up over time, you can actually create a pretty fertile environment in terms of rain and sunlight exposure. But then you have this volcanic material acting like a sieve, or almost like the perfect sieve for water, in that you said retaining just what the vines need and letting the rest run through, which is, not to go back to Santorini too often, but not a lot of rainfall there. And actually really important that the volcanic material actually has that quality that it can retain the moisture that the vines need. And so if it was completely draining through, it wouldn't be good, but that's not the characteristic of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are other things you can do to retain moisture around your vines than just have this or that soil, obviously. And they do employ some of those methods in Santorini, like the basket training, or what do they call it? The technical term. Basket training. The vines look like nests on the ground, so they're able to actually kind of retain moisture within those nests. I saw an article the other day, and I should have pulled it up before. This is perfect for this podcast, but there's a region where they've had these bowl-shaped like volcanic cutouts.
Canary Islands.
Is it the Canary Islands?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. And that kind of acts as a mechanism for retaining water as well.
That's exactly what it protects from the wind, but also they're really big. If you ever have a chance, Google them, but also Google them with a person next to them.
They're massive.
I'm part of a group on Facebook that's called like Winemakers Traveling the World, and is back from when I worked at a winery. And basically it's where people who work vintages go on and people post. There's like yesterday was in Pop Clement. We're going to be hiring for our 2023 harvest. Sign up. So somebody was complaining about how hard the vintage was wherever they were. And somebody's like, oh, you want to see a hard vineyard work? And it was them like in one of those big holes in the Canary Islands. Like, I do hundreds of these every day. And it was just like, it was pretty funny.
Yeah, there's vines grow in some really neat places. I think like our context of these kind of like flat lands up a slightly sloping hill and like perfectly oriented lines of vines is not always the case. You go to different parts of the world.
Yeah, for sure. We'll get into, hopefully that wasn't, I hope nobody's cringing who's like a volcanic wine expert outside of John listening to that. But
Yeah.
that was our high level description. And John gives us a lot more info on like how and why these are important. But let's talk about some regions now that maybe you might be familiar with that you don't know are volcanic. To me, I block them into three buckets. One is like older explosions that have now grown over, but they're just like quality wine producing regions. And maybe there are certain pockets of volcanic soils around, or maybe it's almost exclusively, but it's mixed in with another top layer. So some things come to mind are like Tokai in Hungary, to your point, Oregon, the Willamette Valley. That is a total mishmash of different things because it had the Missoula floods come out. And so there's like a sedimentary pockets, there are different mountainic pockets. Those are a couple examples there. A couple others could be more the living volcanoes. I'm thinking Mount Etna, or not necessarily living, but they're really recent, where the soil hasn't had any chance to break down. So Canary Islands, Santorini, Mount Etna, to some extent further down the slope, it could be broken down. And then last but not least is like the islands that were literally formed by volcanoes, which again, Canary Islands, Madeira, people know that's my favorite. Again, a beautiful, lush island. Why is it lush? There's nutrients and it was a great volcano. So those are just a few. Do you have any that you are particularly into these days, or any recommendations for folks? Like general region, doesn't have to be a producer.
Yeah, I think that the time I got to spend in Santorini really opened my eyes to like the impact that kind of soil has on vines. And especially there, I was really thrown by how big and expressive the white wines were in the region, and still retaining so much of that, like really like that acidic freshness, even especially maybe more on these kind of island territories, but a lot of that like salinity from the ocean water seems to get retained really well there. Not sure if it's not completely owing to the way that the volcanic soils drain, but certainly something that you can find in a lot of these wines. And yeah, I think Washington State, you can see some of this as well. Oregon, like you said, those come to mind, and my exploration is a little bit still early on. But yeah, John gives us a deep dive in. He's obviously one of the foremost experts in the topic. His book, Volcanic Wines, Salt, Grit, and Power, is an awesome volume, and one that if anyone finds it out there, you can send it in to Billy and I. We would love to take it off your hands.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a nice long interview with John, so I don't want to run this intro too long. I would say for my side, look for white wines. We talk about these in the podcast from Hungary, like Tokai, some of those regions. It's very linear. They're amazing. I've been an Etna Rosso fan for a good bit now, so check out the red wines from Sicily. But yes, get ready now. Our guest is, like we've said, John Szabo. He's a master sommelier, Canadian-based, but the foremost expert in volcanic wine. So enjoy our interview with John. All right, we have the volcanic wine guru, John Szabo, with us. Thank you so much for joining today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so I've read on and off about you and your work for a long time now, and I've really wanted to learn more about your writing, your interest in volcanic wines, as well as all the other things you're working on. Do you want to give us a little bit of background on who you are and how you got into wine?
How far do you want me to go back here? I'll give you the short version. How's that?
That's fine.
Like most people in my generation, wine wasn't really a career path that was available to follow. There were very few sommeliers in Canada, actually none, one perhaps, back in the 90s. And I did a degree in languages at the University of Toronto. I studied Spanish and Italian, which of course doesn't really lead you anywhere unless you're staying in academia, which I wasn't going to do. That's how I ended up in the restaurant business. Fascinated by food, by flavors. Ended up working in a number of kitchens in Toronto, Ontario wine country. Ended up in France at a couple of Michelin-starred restaurants in Paris and down in the south. So I really cut my palate, as it were, with food long before wine. But of course, wine is always near at hand in fine dining scenarios. So I just slowly gravitated over to the wine side of things and became fascinated with it. Took a few courses, and 25 years later, here I am writing about wine.
Took a few courses that ended up culminating with a master sommelier. I guess that's...
Of course, yes, there was that.
So as your time working as a sommelier went on, did you find yourself wanting to lean more into the education, or did you find yourself narrowing in on certain aspects of wine that you really found more fascinating?
Yeah, I saw the wine business from just about all sides. I had a little brief period as an importer of wines in Ontario. When I got back from France, I had discovered all of these terrific French country wines, as we called them back in the day, lesser known regions, the Loire, Alsace, Languedoc, Roussillon, these sort of places that weren't available in our market at the time. I fell into the import business, wanting to get some of these wines into the country just for my own personal enjoyment, and thought, why not share them with others at the same time? And you probably know a little bit about the Canadian market, where government-run monopolies from province to province, and it's a tough business to be in when they can arbitrarily change the rules of the game overnight, and you got to reinvent your business model. So I thought maybe that's not the best business to be in. Spent some time on the floor, of course, in a few restaurants selling wine, but then I realized that I wasn't really a great salesperson either, to be perfectly honest. But given my background in languages, loved writing. Actually, I went on a trip to Hungary. My background's Hungarian. I have some family in Budapest, but went to Tokaj in 2000 was the vintage. I remember it vividly because it was a brilliant Tokaj vintage, one of those years where botrytis is everywhere. And came back, was so excited, wrote an article, submitted it to a Canadian publication, and they said, wow, that's pretty good. Can you do more? So I said, yes, I can do more. So that's how I got into wine writing. And that's more or less where I've been since then, writing principally about wine with a publication called Wine Align and lots of other publications, both in Canada and elsewhere. Wine and Spirits magazine in the US, for example, written a lot for them, Wine Enthusiast, and then some stuff over in the UK. And it's great. So it allows me to do what I love to do, which is travel and experience as broad a swath of the world of wine as possible. Because for me, it's all about discovery. It's all about new flavors. It's all about finding what's new, which is usually old, and then making it new again.
So what year did you achieve your MS again? I was looking on your site.
In 2004.
2004. And so after the MS, did you return to hospitality? Or in terms of your involvement in hospitality, where did that kind of make a clean break and you didn't return back to floor service? Was it after your MS?
It was, in fact, after the MS. By that point, I'd moved on to more writing, and also I got into education, worked with a number of regional associations presenting on wines and such, putting together presentations. Yeah, ironically, by the time I passed my MS, I was kind of out of the day-to-day hospitality, but never too far away. Going in and training restaurant staff was something I did for many years, still do from time to time.
So I'm interested to hear you maybe just talk briefly about the difference between like wine writing and description and sort of education, and then like classroom education and sales on the floor. Maybe the differences between those three things and why you felt like maybe those skills didn't necessarily transfer over. Because to me, a good educator can be a great salesperson, but that wasn't what you found. So we'd like to hear you talk a little bit about the differences between those experiences in wine for you.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And sure, having some knowledge and being able to share that is a big part about getting people excited about whatever it is you're talking about, certainly wine included. And we all know that wine is a field that's replete with fantastic stories and great backgrounds that really add to the overall enjoyment of the product outside of the molecules swimming around in the glass in front of us. That side of it, I was very much involved with and interested in. As they say, there's no better way to learn than to teach, and I learned a hell of a lot while teaching, supposedly the expert, but then you're faced with a group of students, each with a keen mind of their own, asking questions from angles that you hadn't quite considered, which forces you to go back and look at things again and relearn them, or at least add to your learning. That was very satisfying for me. But I think to be a really good salesman, like on the floor or out pounding door to door, you got to be pretty aggressive, and that's just not in my personality. On the floor, I was much more comfortable, but my brief stint as an importer and also selling wines, of course, found that a little bit tougher, to sit across the table from someone and trying to convince them that this was the greatest wine of all time and that they had to have it on their list. Yeah, it takes a smooth talker and an aggressive personality. I don't mean violently aggressive, but you gotta keep knocking and not
assertive and persistent. Yeah.
When the phone doesn't get picked up, you can't get dejected and throw your hands in the air. You got to keep at it.
Yeah, I think in our podcast, Brady is the quintessential salesperson, and I'm the person who would tell you like a 30-minute story about a wine that was probably like the lowest margin in my portfolio, but because I thought it was cool.
Both strategies can work. It just depends on the audience.
Awesome. Quickly, before we move on to your main thrust here, where did you live in the south of France, and I guess France in general?
So I was in Paris for about six months and worked in a little restaurant in Montmartre called Beauvilliers. It's famous as the most flowery restaurant in the capital because the dining room was always filled with these beautiful flowers. Anyhow, it wasn't easy work. Cooking at that level is a lot of repetitive drudgery, but that's what it takes to get something artistic on the plate. And then went down to the south of France to a little village called Florensac, which I'm sure not too many listeners will have heard of. It's really quite a tiny village between Montpellier and Béziers, just outside of Montpellier, to give you an idea. And there was another Michelin-starred restaurant there that my then girlfriend, now wife, and I fell upon, and they were short-staffed, so we ended up living and working there for about 5 months.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, my brother did a gap year in Corbière, so we got to go over there, and that's the most experience I've had, but I really want to go back to that kind of area.
Oh, the Corbière is wild. And one of the great things we did before getting the job at that restaurant, we did a little tour on the Canal du Midi. It's the canal that links Bordeaux with the port of Sète. And we just rented a little houseboat and putted along. And I had brought a bunch of wine with me from Paris. And we'd stop at the local markets, pick up some food and eat and drink. And actually the World Cup was going on at that point. This was 1998 in France. So it was just a magical atmosphere.
Wow. Nice. I'm jealous of that experience. I definitely want to. I never thought about houseboating down the Canal de Midi. That's awesome. Cool. So let's dive in a little bit more now. We can talk about a lot of the things you're working on. You have your own podcast. You've written a book. You're helping either spearheading this wine conference on volcanic wines. But let's dive into it. Volcanic wines. How did you find a passion for them, or find really a niche and as something you really wanted to learn more and share with the world?
Yeah, it's funny you say niche. And it does really seem like a super niche subject, no? Volcanic wines. Wines already is niche for most people in the world. But what's funny about volcanic wines, and what I had to convince a publisher of when I was looking for one, is that it's actually not that niche a field if you think about it, outside of being in wine. But a book on champagne, that's niche. That's one type of wine, one region, one part of the world. And that's it. A few different producers with different styles. Volcanic Wines covers an amazingly large sort of section of planet wine. For the book that I wrote, I went to at least a dozen countries and missed a few that I would go back now and include, and probably 36 regions, countless grape varieties. I'm talking not a couple dozen, but 50, 60, 70, 80, I don't know. I've never done the count. And then you've got every climate from subtropical practically to as far north and cold as you can get in the world of wine. So I know it sounds like a niche subject, but in the end it covers a whole lot of wines, a whole lot of styles. So how did I get into it? That's a great question. Again, accidentally. I was writing for a magazine here in Canada a few years ago, and it was one of those year-end articles. The editor said, can you write me your paragraph on your favorite wines or your favorite wine of the year or something like that? So I was trying to be clever. It's written about Champagne or Barolo, Burgundy, and I wanted to get outside the box. And I had just been recently to Santorini in Greece and also to northern Hungary, back there again, where there's a lot of terrific volcanic wines. Etna had just recently popped up on my radar. So I wrote this little tongue-in-cheek article, my favorite wine grows on the side of a volcano. And I had some fun writing that, sent it in, and the editor said, wow, that's really interesting. Can you maybe turn that into a full article? I said, I don't know, let's have a look. So I started to do a little bit more research and then realized it was this amazing, incredible collection of wines around the world. While writing that article, I thought, here's an interesting subject potentially for a book. I had already written a book before that, so I had a little idea what I was getting into, but really no idea of what a big project this would turn into.
Yeah, in the fall of this past year, my wife and I were in Santorini and really got to experience some of this firsthand there. And I was so surprised at what a difficult climate it is on an island like that, especially with this volcanic material. There's basically nothing organic on the island that's growing. And I think they said they only had 5 inches of rain within that growing season. Obviously, all the moisture, I guess, comes from early morning mist and off the ocean. I guess you could speak to that more than me, but I was just surprised at how difficult the conditions are, but how incredible the wines are in these regions. And yeah, would love to hear, especially about some of the northernmost places that you went to, because even Santorini is a Mediterranean, sunny sort of environment.
Well, from difficult situations are born interesting things, and I think that's certainly true in the world of wine. It tends to be on the boundaries, on the margins of where grapes will ripen viably, or where you can viably, feasibly do viticulture, that you end up with really fascinating products. In a garden like, I don't know, Central Valley, California, where just about anything will grow. Easy to grow wine, make wine, but it's a little more challenging to make really what I would call memorable wine or top-notch wine. So Santorini is a great example of a pretty extreme, almost hostile environment for anything to grow. Probably when you were there, you tasted the little cherry tomatoes that they grow on the island and the capers. Those are all just so packed with flavor. You can almost taste the struggle in those things. And the same is true in the wine. Those vines struggle to produce a couple of kilos per plant. If we looked at average yields, they'd be pathetically low, which explains to some degree why the price of Santorini has gone up considerably since I started writing about those wines 10 years ago. But yeah, you're quite right. It's drier than should be feasible for grapevines, which are notoriously good in arid climates, but there it's really dry. And it is indeed, you're right, the moisture that lifts out of the caldera, and you got to see the caldera as this spectacular volcanic crater in the middle of the island that was once whole, that exploded about 3,500 years ago, but that mist creeps out of the caldera at night and then settles on the surface in where the vineyards are. And here's the magic of the particular volcanic soils of Santorini. A lot of pumice with almost zero organic matter, but that pumice literally sponges up that moisture from the air and then gives that back to the plant during the day or the night as they need. So it's a magical combination with that particular type of soil. I don't think certainly the wine would be different. And we could get into a couple of the interesting chemistry aspects of it. I don't know if that's part of the remit for this episode. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I wanted to correct. I think I said 5 inches of rain. That's doing it way too much justice. I believe it was 5 days of rain is what we were told. So it only rained 5 different days during the summer season there. Super dry.
When it comes to the chemical compound, what are some of the through lines that you find that are either unique to certain areas like Santorini, or like that you find that are common throughout the volcanic wines? Because I think there definitely is like a line of similarity in some sense.
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. That's the question. First one I always get is, well, what does a volcanic wine taste like? And amusingly enough, I start out the book with the line, there's no such thing as volcanic wine in the singular, because there really isn't any volcanic wine that works across the board. But there is this amazing collection of volcanic wines in the plural, that these combinations of soil and grapes and traditions that make for some very unique and singular wines. I could tell you my kind of overarching view of how I view volcanic wines. Don't ask me to justify that scientifically. But for me, if we were to take the world of wine and just cleave it into two very basic halves, you'd have your fruity wines on one side and your savory wines on the other side. Obviously, there's plenty of overlap in between. Most tasters can agree, this is pretty fruity wine, or this is not so fruity, this is more savory. Volcanic wines, for me, fall on the savory side of that divide. Lots of salinity, lots of sapidity, and in many cases, like in the case of Santorini, there's certainly some garden variety sodium chloride that comes straight out of the sea spray, and then gets deposited in the soil and then makes its way into ferments via either the skins of the grapes or through some metabolism process into the juice itself and then into the wine. But it's been measured. I'm not making this up. You can measure sodium and other mineral salt contents of wines, and these wines are measurably higher than inland counterparts. Actually did a study with a producer from Santorini called Yannis Paraskevopoulos from Yea Estate, and he's got Assyrtiko, the main variety, planted in the Peloponnese, mainland Greece, pretty far from the sea, and Assyrtiko, of course, planted on the island of Santorini, and I can't remember the exact measure, but it was something like 300 times more salt components in the Santorini version than the Peloponnese version, and a couple of other things that stood out. Yeah, there you go. And one last thing I got to tell you, because, I'm always shocked tasting Santorini wines, how fresh they are from this warm, hot, dry Mediterranean climate. You have pHs that are ridiculously low, like unfathomably low. You'd expect that in a Mosel Riesling in northern Germany, on these really fresh, tangy wines. And that has to do with the lack of potassium in the soils. Not to get technical, but potassium is an acid buffer, and if the plants absorb a lot of it and it's in the grapes, the pH always shoots through the roof. But without potassium, they're like under 3 very frequently. So some cool things like that you see in various volcanic places around the world that really do speak to the distinctiveness of these wines.
Go ahead, Brady.
Yeah, I was going to. So these extremely high alcohol wines, especially for whites, and the experiences that I've had, still talking about Santorini, but I wanted maybe you to talk about some of these other regions and how alcohol, the level of alcohol maybe changes the perception of these wines. Obviously in volcanic soils, you might have, whether you're talking about in California or Oregon or somewhere else in the world, going to have really any grape variety could grow in these places. But is there any impact on like alcohol and sort of the outcomes of the grapes being grown in these volcanic materials?
Alcohol is more directly related to climate, obviously, and photosynthesis, sunlight availability. Not that it's not linked at all to soil, it certainly is. And again, without getting too technical, we can look at things like nutrient availability and pH of a soil in particular, like an acid soil, for example. It makes it more of a struggle for the vines to absorb nutrients, or a different range of nutrients. And yeah, I've seen a correlation between lower alcohol and volcanic wines, knowing that many, not all, but many volcanic soils are on the lower side of the pH scale, so that is more acid and more of a challenging environment for the vine. So the way I describe it, they get a broad diet of all the macro and micro elements that they need, but nothing in excess. And the other common feature very frequently is that they're pretty low on the water retention scale. Sometimes they're almost pure rock, and you can't grow on pure rock. But some of these younger volcanic regions, which erupted a short period ago, haven't yet weathered into soil, so they don't hold a lot of water. And like the sands of Etna, the volcanic sands on the slopes of Mount Etna, don't really absorb much water. So that makes it tough for the plants to absorb. They get what they need, but they get it in small quantities. And then they spend their energy on putting flavors into grapes to make them attractive to birds and other animals to go and distribute them. That's the main raison d'etre of a vine, is not to make wine for us, it's to spread themselves. But I've seen like fully ripe, fully developed flavors in volcanic wines at 12.5%, 13% alcohol, sometimes even lower than that.
I think I got a little meandering in my question, but I was just so surprised on Santorini that the wines had so much acidity, they were so fresh, but the alcohol was so high. It seemed like those three elements like really held together very nicely, because when I think of a high acid wine, like from volcanic soils, I don't usually think high alcohol, which is maybe a more clear line at what I was trying to get at.
Here's my theory on that, if I could share. We talk very often about indigenous varieties and how well adapted they are to terroirs, and it's kind of cliche now, but it's true. If you think back, and we don't have to go too far back, a couple of 100 years, when nobody really knew what was happening, when the wine was bubbling away, it just turned into something magical. There was no way of adjusting it. They didn't know what pH was. They couldn't have adjusted pH or acidified in any way. So whatever they were growing had to be naturally balanced from the beginning. If it didn't work in that climate, then you'd end up with vinegar or worse every year. So that would be discarded. And the other varieties that do produce a naturally balanced must, and therefore wine, would have been the ones that were retained. And one of the key elements of a stable wine is, we're back to acidity and pH. If the pH is too high, bacteria get in and you get a little bacterial swampy mess at the end of the day that doesn't taste very pleasant. And those wines wouldn't have survived until the following vintage. So by course of natural selection, the varieties that had naturally high acids for their given climate would have been those that were kept. So that kind of explains Santorini. It's a feature of Assyrtiko that it reaches high alcohol levels, does that on the mainland, but with pHs that are much higher compared to Santorini. So it was like a perfect adaptation or perfect combination of terroir and grape variety.
Can you, moving on a little bit from Santorini, I guess two-part question. One is, Can you talk a little bit about the different types of volcanic soils, whether it be like more of a pumice type base or like a basalt type base, kind of as they weather over time? And then maybe a couple of regions. We can talk on a number of regions, but I would like to maybe touch on some regions that people may not think of as volcanic. Like I know I love the wines of Tokai before I realized that those were volcanic. I guess Madeira makes a little more sense, but some of these aren't on the side of a volcano like Mount Etna or even Santorini.
Yes, the discussion about different types of volcanic soils can be long, so I'll give you again the short version of that. But suffice to say that, yes, there's a very broad range of stuff that gets emitted out of a volcano, and there are different types of eruptions. Some of the more familiar types of volcanic rock would be like basalt, for example. That's a very popular one, and that tends to sputter out of volcanoes. Think of typical Hawaiian style eruption where it just thins out and flows down the side and slowly builds up the edifice, the stratovolcano as they're called technically, with layer after layer of lava which hardens into basalt. Is just one type of lava. There are lots of different types of lava. We see that on the slopes of Mount Etna. You see that all throughout northern Hungary, the Willamette Basin, Willamette Valley in Oregon, and Washington State for that matter, sits on 2 miles, I think it is, of volcanic outflow from a little bit further up by Montana. Lots of basalt. And then the chemical composition varies between the different types of lava. I won't get into those details, but each of those affects to a degree the growing environment of the plant, and therefore we can make the leap to a different flavor and structure profile.
All right. So in that sense, you mentioned the Willamette. We've touched on Tokai a little bit. What are some regions that are maybe volcanic that people may not always attribute with being volcanic?
Yeah, you mentioned some of the obvious ones, places that were formed by volcanoes, like the Azores, Portuguese archipelago, Madeira, also very volcanic, the Canary Islands. These are volcanic hotspots, quite literally, that are nothing but volcanic rock because they're made from volcanoes. But then you get into areas of more mixed geology, and it gets a little bit tougher to draw fine lines around what's volcanic and what's not volcanic. So Napa Valley's a great example of that. Most of the Vaca Range was formed by volcanoes, parts of the Mayacamas, but not all. And then this area of amazing seismic activity, as you know there, Billy, on the West Coast. You're sitting at a triple junction, they call it in geology, where you've got 3 different massive tectonic plates all jostling alongside one another. Most famous outcome of that is the San Andreas Fault, but that's one of hundreds of faults literally all throughout California. And that means when these plates start banging against one another, that mountains are built and troughs are created and soils get mixed. So in Napa and Sonoma, there's some 50 million year old volcanic stuff that came from the ocean that was deposited as the Pacific Plate moved towards the West Coast. And then slicing and dicing makes it for an amazingly terrific place to study geology, but tough for wine writers and their map makers to separate what's truly volcanic from what is volcanic from what is not really volcanic at all. I don't want to be too prescriptive about it. It wasn't meant to be a book on geology. It's a book on celebrating wines from this kind of broad range of soil types.
What's your sense of the consumer education around distinction between a wine from volcanic soils versus anything else? Is your sense that there's becoming greater awareness in consumer markets, or maybe, I guess, starts with importers, about some of the distinct characteristics here? And is that becoming more of a talking point?
I think I'd be wishfully projecting if I were to say that, oh yeah, consumers are catching on and a good number of them understand the difference between limestone and volcanic. I don't think we're there yet. Maybe we'll never get there. Maybe we shouldn't ever get there. But I was recently asked a very similar question for the International Sommelier Association magazine. They were doing a little special on soils, and they asked me if I thought it was a good idea to create a wine list based on soil type, which is an interesting idea, and I've seen it done before. I've seen volcanic wine sections, and you've got to be a pretty switched-on wine bar to do something like that. But I think if you've got the right staff and the right environment, and there's an expected exchange between diner and server, then you can have some fun and you can introduce wine through a different lens and get people thinking and maybe trying something different. If you tried to do that at I don't know, I'm going to throw something out here, an Outback Steakhouse, you're just going to alienate most diners. Like, man, I just want a glass of Chardonnay. Why are you throwing the Anakin slate and gravel at me? Is it good? Is it not good? So the answer is yes and no. On the trade side, yeah, there's certainly been growing awareness. We did the first Volcanic Wine International Conference in 2018 in New York City, and there was a lot of interest even then. And the subsequent edition in 2019, even bigger. And we had a little hiatus like everyone else, and back in New York City this June for the third edition. And by all signals, it looks to be even bigger than the previous ones. At least the interest in the trade is certainly there.
Yeah, no, I was trying to figure out how to get invited to one of those.
That's right. Yeah.
Very simple. Send you an invitation after we sign off here.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. And I'll convince Vince we'll have a whole volcanic collection. But one thing I've always thought about is interesting for me explaining volcanic wines to friends is it's a lot easier for people to understand this came from a volcano than maybe limestone that I have to explain was one seabed and then the sea went away, or that's why there's shells in it. Same thing with trying to explain like granite. Like I'm just not that great with igneous rocks in general. But do you ever find that it's like one of the easier soils to explain to people? So maybe if they don't know a lot, you're like, this was grown in a volcano, and they're like, cool, I like it.
Yeah, everybody has heard of a volcano, right? And it just seems to capture people's imagination immediately without even having to go into any of the details. It's wow, that's a pretty cool concept. I think that's what first hit that editor I mentioned all those years ago about this concept of wines growing on the side of a volcano. And it's not great, I shouldn't say that, but it certainly people are reminded of volcanoes regularly with eruptions. Etna seems to be erupting every other month, sometimes more frequently than that. Every year there are a few dozen volcanic eruptions around the world, some more destructive than others. But it doesn't take much to trigger a sense of curiosity with the mention of volcanoes, even if many of these regions are no longer active. In fact, many of them aren't. There won't be an eruption anywhere near no, that's not true. I was going to say the Willamette Valley, but yeah, you've got a number of active volcanoes right there in the Cascades. Chile, yeah, still super active. Italy, still super active. Okay, let's go to northern Italy. Soave. Volcanic activity stopped there about 30 million years or so ago. So I think we can safely say that's not dormant, that's extinct.
On the Soave side, and then I'll let Brady hop in, I've been monopolizing, where the difference between Soave Classico and Soave, it's been expanded for so long. Is the Classico, the hill, a little bit more volcanic than the greater plain? Does that just become like super alluvial, or how is that differentiation made?
Yeah, all of the good volcanics in Soave are pretty much contained in that Classico zone. Basic Soave DOCG, that extends into the plains. And of course, there's lots of volcanic material that washed out of those hills over the last 30-odd million years or so. But for me, at least, in my definition, it's become too dilute and not truly volcanic any longer. But there are plenty of spots that are. And in fact, Soave is maybe one of the best places on the planet to go and do direct comparative tastings. And this is what we love to do in the wine business. It's our fun Saturday night. You can compare the main grape of Soave grown on basalts. And these are beautiful, pillowy basalts, nice and black. They look like straight out of Encyclopedia Britannica. And right next to pure white limestone. And in fact, there's one little spot, I describe it in the book, and actually had the experience driving up the hillside with the fellow running the consortio of Soave Classico, and he stops the car, and he says, okay, John, get out. And he points, he says, look at the beautiful lavas, look at the beautiful basalt. I'm looking at, that's pretty cool, that's great. He says, okay, back in the car, drive literally maybe a couple of 100 yards up the hill around a bend, stops the car again, says, John, get out. And now you see the limestones. And there was this beautiful layer of white limestone with some yellow sand underneath. And right above that, on the hillside, were vines growing. And then, of course, we went back to the office and did a tasting of all the volcanic Soaves and all of the limestone Soaves. And you know what? They don't taste the same. There are real differences there. This is not just in our minds. We're not just inventing these differences. They're measurably different, but more importantly, they taste different.
Is there I'm sure tons of varieties have been planted in volcanic soils. Are Are there any that you would like to see planted more often and tried to be planted in volcanic soils that aren't currently? I know you talked a little bit about varieties that are indigenous to a particular region, especially if that material has been there a long time. Yeah, but do you think about that often, and what are some of those varieties?
Yeah, that was one of the kind of unexpected findings of the research, just how many indigenous unique varieties found along these volcanic travels. I can't say it's directly related to the volcanism, probably not, but it just seems this disproportionate number of indigenous varieties have persisted in these volcanic regions, and they don't really grow too many other places. So Assyrtiko we've already talked about from Santorini. It's now been pretty widely planted in the rest of Greece and elsewhere in the world. There's some in California, there's some in Australia, South Africa. So it's made its way, although in a very small percentage. But other grapes like Caricante from Etna, I don't know that it really grows anywhere else. Probably somebody's experimenting with it somewhere, but not in any real commercial sense. There's a pretty rare grape variety from Hungary, from north of Lake Balaton in the Badacsony area called Kéknyelű. Mouthful to say, but man, one of the most fascinating grapes I came across. It's one of these varieties that's so old, or shall I say underdeveloped, that it doesn't pollinate, doesn't self-pollinate. Oh, wow. So it has to be planted next to another variety that flowers at around the same time so that you get a harvest. Otherwise, you don't get fertilization of your grapes at all. So I can see why that wouldn't be widely planted in other parts of the world. It's a little challenging to grow. But when it grows in these volcanic soils on mostly extinct, dormant, at least volcanoes on the north shores of Lake Balaton, it creates this amazingly non-fruity, super saline, sapid, crunchy, but broad at the same time style of wine. These are the things I'd love to see planted more of around the world. How they would perform, it's hard to say, but worth a try.
Do you think part of the ratio of these older grapes surviving is just the soil wasn't as conducive to phylloxera and that allowed some to continue to power through?
Yeah, that's undoubtedly part of the story, because there are quite a few pre-phylloxera plantings in lots of parts, but certainly not all parts of the volcanic world. Etna's a good example here again of a place where, because of the volcanic sandy nature of the soils, phylloxera never really took hold. So there are plenty of 100, 110-year-old vines still planted on the side of that volcano. And where else could we go? Italy is a treasure trove of indigenous varieties, of course, and also old vines. Campania, inland from Naples. Man, I saw the most radical landscapes I've seen anywhere on Planet Wine. They have these 200-300-year-old vines that were trellised up 2 or 3 meters, 10, 12 feet up trees, sometimes up wooden stakes that had been planted in the ground. And it looks like a vine forest more than a vineyard. Like you can walk under the vines and the trunks are massive because they're 300 years old. And you think, wow, I'm looking at a scene that could have been painted 300 years ago, was painted 300 years ago. And here we are all these years later, still standing and still collecting and still making wine from these grapes. For me, it was fascinating.
Brady, do you want to?
Yeah, and the other example was an island like Santorini where phylloxera wasn't coming across because it's an island. And there are varieties there like a theory, which I know they're blending with the Assyrtiko, which I thought was really incredible. I didn't have that on the mainland, I don't believe. At least it's not planted often, right?
Not in any commercial quantity, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Not much anyhow.
Wanted to transition a little bit to talk about your book, which Billy, I think, has a little bit more experience with, and maybe talk a little bit more about some of your other projects. What is your sort of main focus right now in terms of your writing and your time in general? I know we briefly mentioned this conference coming up as well, which you have a part in, but where's most of your time going in this discipline?
Currently, it's writing, as I mentioned, so that my day job, my main publication, is called winealign.com, as in we align, and we endeavor to taste as many of the wines coming into Canada as possible. And then it's a glorified buyer's guide, a shopping tool. Not to diminish our brilliant work. That's all we're trying to do is connect consumers with the wines that they're looking for. And the concept is that so it's not just me writing, it's a group of us, or about 4 or 5 regular critics, and we all taste more or less the same wines, or as many of the same wines as we can, and we all post our reviews independently. And then as a subscriber, as a reader, you can go online and read what I wrote about a particular wine and what Sarah or David or Michael or one of my colleagues wrote and what their score is, and then taste that wine and then agree or disagree. So I don't know what John was thinking. This wine is terrible. I can't drink this. So I'm not going to trust his reviews. So you can actually set your settings to increase the importance of the scores of your favorite critics. When you go through and you search for a wine, it will pop up the top reviewed wines, the top scoring wines of your favorite critics that are currently available in your local government store. So that's the general concept. And then on top of that, we write plenty of travel articles and in-depth pieces on regions that we visited and whatever neat other tastings we've been to, vertical tastings or what have you. So yeah, that keeps me pretty busy most of the time. And then, as you mentioned, the podcast, Wine Thieves, my partner Sarah D'Amato and I, we started that a couple of years ago as a sort of side project, a pandemic era. It was something I've always wanted to do and finally had the time and looked into the how-to and figured it out reasonably quickly. And now we're into episode 76 or 77. So we've had some good traction over the last few years. And for me, it was a brilliant way to keep in touch with winemakers around the world. Some I knew, some I met over Zoom, but learned a lot and kept abreast of everything that was happening in a time when we couldn't travel as much.
And then go ahead.
Good, bro.
I was just going to say, you're also helping out with the cellar art. I don't know how to properly say it. You're writing some blurbs for this company as well?
Yeah, Cell Art's a company based out of Montreal, and they design, they don't call them cellars so much, they call them wine spaces. So they've found their own little niche in that industry, in a growing segment of the market that's looking for not just a place, a closet to store wines, but actually a piece of art within the living space. So yeah, they'll build you a cellar in your basement if you want. Of course, they've got all the know-how to do that, but they're much more focused on creating works of art. They've collaborated with local artists to design these really spectacular spaces that are not only beautiful, they're also functional. They asked me to do some writing for them a while back. It's been a while since I've contributed, but probably I'll start that up again. It's a company that's really fascinating to follow.
What are some of the goals for the Volcanic Wine Conference? You said this is the third one this year. What's maybe some of the goals this year, and how do you see that growing and expanding as you continue to have them?
The stated aim, I guess, if you read the press release that came out today, is to shine the spotlight on some of these lesser known regions and varieties and producers and celebrate the diversity that exists in the world of wine under this kind of loose volcanic umbrella, which is niche, but it's not really niche. And a lot of the wines happen to be bloody delicious too. So that's a good little thing on the side. And I think the trade's always seeking, I certainly hope, but we're always seeking to continue to learn, to deepen our understanding, deepen our connection to this product, which is at once cultural, but it's also, there's science, there's art, there's everything that we love about it wrapped into it. And this is just a slightly different angle to look at it that, as we've discussed, has captured some imagination. So really, yeah, there's no grander goal than that, other than to just share a little bit of love for these wines and get people excited about them, and hopefully for a few indigenous rare varieties along the way that might be in danger of extinction if nobody knows about them and nobody cares about them and nobody's willing to pay for what it costs to farm and turn them into wine. Because volcanic regions can be pretty tricky sometimes for any number of extreme reasons, and not least of which being a potential eruption in some parts of the world that can wipe out generations of your family's efforts in a flash.
Literally. What are some of the regions for 2023 that you're most excited about, or a handful that you really just want to get on everybody's radar? I feel like Etna has gotten up there in recent years, Etna Rosso, as well as the Biancos or Caracantes and all that. I feel like Canary Islands, at least here in LA, I've seen them around a little bit. What are you trying to really promote this year? Some year?
Yeah, those two regions you mentioned have gone really from almost zero recognition. I remember the first time I tasted an Etna Rosso in Toronto was probably 2008. Never even heard of the variety, never even really heard of Etna as a volcano when I was teaching MS intro courses. Prior to that, there was zero mention of Etna in the whole Sicily lecture. And now we're going to lead with that, just to give you an idea. And in a decade or so, how far it's come along. Canary's similar, though maybe not quite at the level of Etna just yet. I'd like to see countries like Hungary, not simply because I've got some background there, but I really believe it's one of the last kind of, I wouldn't say undiscovered, but certainly less discovered, less popular countries from that part of the world that has been producing wine for a couple of thousand years, like everyone else in that corner. But viticulture, winemaking techniques, knowledge, everything has just exploded in the last 10, 20 years. It's really ripe for discovery. Lots of great indigenous varieties, lots of volcanics, but not only. There's some great limestone there as well. And my tastes cover all stones, not just volcanics. And certainly not volcanic, but again, I look out my window and down the highway at Niagara Peninsula in Canada. I'm sure, I know you don't really know that down in the US, but the Canadian wine industry has also grown leaps and bounds in the last 15, 20 years. And now that everyone is looking for cool, literally cool regions, everyone in warm regions is trying to go higher into the mountains or further out to the coast to find that cool spot. Canada obviously has that pretty well dialed. Naturally, don't have to go too far to find cold. It's all around us. Some terrific Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Noir, Gamay. These are varieties, Cabernet Franc, that really thrive very much in your Finger Lakes, where I just spent a week touring around down there, and I was pretty impressed by the quality and the number of producers making quality wines.
Nice. Yeah, no, I'm hungry. I was in Budapest 4 years ago and got to taste a whole bunch of wine and then came back trying to tell everybody about them. So I definitely 100% agree on that. And I really want to visit too. I've been trying to introduce my partner to different parts of Europe, and we haven't really cracked Eastern Europe yet. So I'm excited too.
It's there for the cracking.
Yeah.
Check out Croatia as well. Croatia is a pretty fascinating country, another one with 30, 40 indigenous varieties commercially produced that are really worth a look.
Nice. Yeah, we did Slovenia last summer. We were inching our way over, but nice. Yeah, I'll keep that on the radar. Anything else you want to add, Brady? I think I've covered all my questions, although I could keep going for a while.
Yeah. No, that's great, John. We really appreciate having you on and sharing with us. It's definitely something that Billy and I don't get to talk a lot about on the podcast. So thanks for sharing your knowledge, and best of luck with the conference. You'll have to have us up there, and Billy can keynote here in a couple of years once he becomes a volcanic wine expert as well.
There you go. So mark June 21st on your calendars, New York City, the City Winery on the Hudson Riverside. If you're familiar with that place, great little venue. Yeah. And we're expecting about 50, 60 wineries, some great speakers. Got a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist from Duke University who's coming up to do a little talk on how we smell and how we associate feelings with aromas, volcanic or otherwise, but that should be pretty fun. Some volcanologists coming. So it should be a great conference. I hope to see you there.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining. All right, that was our interview with John Szabo. I hope everybody enjoyed learning about volcanic wines. I really encourage everyone to seek some out, try them from the different regions, really explore the different expressions that can come from those types of soils. Also, if anybody knows where to buy his book for under $500, please let me know. Either put it in the comments on YouTube or just send us directly. Really interested to find that somewhere, somehow. But that's the end of our episode. So until next week, cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circulars amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.